And we're live. Hey guys, Phil here, Zon Master, Ruby on Rails, other things like that. And today I want to do a little demo / tutorial about deploying or setting up a server in the cloud and deploying your Rails app and get that up and running. The Rails app that I'm going to use is the one that I did the last time, this ActionCable, just because it's a Rails 6.1 app that I happen to have lying around that we know works. We saw it last time. So I'm going to get that up there into the cloud. This demo is based on two things. First of all, the great tutorial from the guys at Go Rails that I used as a starting point, and I use, but mostly it's based on my interpretation of that I use to launch servers, and I have used to launch servers for the last several years. I do it this way. There are other ways to do it. You know, you could try and create an image, and you could try and use a Docker and image and all that other stuff, but I find this way is fast, it works, and you know, it's native. I don't like the idea of running a Docker image. Maybe I'm just old-fashioned. So let's get started. I do all my hosting on DigitalOcean, and I've used DigitalOcean for years and years, 7 or 8 years maybe at least. And we're going to do all of this live inside of my account, so I might have to pixel out some things. That's why I'm not doing a live screencast of this. But I've created a new project inside of DigitalOcean, and I'm going to create my server inside of that. Now for this example, I'm not going to create a managed database or a load balancer, both of which I strongly recommend. Maybe if somebody is interested, I'll show how to do this, or I'll show what's needed to be done to create a managed database and get your Rails instance running on that. Managed database is so awesome because then you having the guys at DigitalOcean look after your stuff, you know, and there's no problems about backups and replication and things like that. You can have all of that kind of done auto-magically. But we're not going to do that. We're doing a straight single server app like if you were just starting out doing proof of concept. Again, other people do things like using Heroku. I'm an old-fashioned kind of guy. I like to have a server. I like to have my own operating system, full access, and root access, and all of that stuff. So we're going to set up an Ubuntu server. I use Ubuntu 20 for this because, well, it's 2021 now, isn't it? So I'm just going to use the straight Ubuntu 20.04 LTS release. I'm going to do a basic server. You can do, in reality, I often use CPU optimized servers, but for this basic thing, we're going to just do a basic server, and I'm going to just go for the $20 a month, 4 gig, 2 CPU, 1. And you can choose where you're going to set this thing up. For fun, sometimes there are implications of where you set this up, you know, like certain features may or may not be available. Well, seeing as we're not using any features, let's use San Francisco 3. And I always do IP6, I don't know why. And monitoring, and we're going to set my SSH key. So that means that the root account on this machine will have SSH by private key enabled by default. So we don't have to worry about a password. Never use passwords, and we'll talk more about that a bit later. And let's call this the Cable Guy demo machine. It's in the demo project. We don't need to add backups. I don't ever usually do that. I don't see the need. I mean, we're deploying from a GitHub repository. All the configuration, you know, I have in the repository or somewhere else. There's nothing special on that machine, so I don't usually do backups. If only if there's assets, and those assets are all stored in the cloud. You know, usually I'm using S3 or something like that for images and all that. So that's it. Let's create the droplet. And after this droplet is created, I'm going to have to pop over and set the IP in the domain name that we're going to use for this example. So there will be a slight cut in the video there while I do that. It just takes a second or minute or whatever to set up the machine. That's it. Here's our IP address. Now let me go over and set it, and I'll be back in a second. And we're back. So the domain name has been set up, and so we're good to go. So this is our IP. Now, I have created a great big long text file that's everything I'm going to do in this tutorial. And I'm going to check that text file into the GitHub repository for Cable Guy, and I will also maybe put it separately as a gist or something. See if you don't want to look at the GitHub repository. So what we need to do is find wherever I've got your server IP, and we're going to replace it with the IP of the server. And there we go. And what else do I need to do? So I also need to find, was it your app? And we're going to call that Cable Guy. Place all of those. And your domain name. And we're going to replace all of those with fearofbeingaverage.com. And hopefully I did all of that right, but we'll find out in a second. Let's dive in and set up this server. So let's root SSH root to this box. In we go. There we are. Looks good. Holy cow, 86 updates can be done immediately. Let's add a user. For this thing, since what we're going to do is deploy, let's call our user deploy. And let's create a password. For passwords, I use something like NordPass or Norton password generator. So let's copy that password. I'll put a link to these down below as well in case you want to use those. So here's the password, and it's very important to remember to keep these passwords somewhere. And there we go. Is the information correct? Yes, it is. Now, something that we need to do is, okay, let's put this user into the sudo group so that they can do the sudo command, because we'll need to do that. So that means sudo is so that you can, do issue commands above your station, as a super user. And most importantly, you have to edit SSHD config. And the reason you need to do this is because what we want to do is have this deploy user log in using a key, not using a password, of course. But the way that the SSHD config comes out of the box is that password authentication is turned off. So we need to quickly just turn that on for a minute, and then restart SSHD. That means that now we can log in with a password, and you'll see why we want to do that in a second. So let's log off this box for a second, and I'm going to say let's use SSH copy ID. Now I'm on a Mac, so maybe things are slightly different for you, but what we want to do is take our key and copy that. This, funnily enough, copies your ID up onto the server, and this is why we need to have password access, because it's going to ask us for our password. Of course, if you're putting the key on the server, you have to be able to get in by a password. So let's just see if that worked. Now if we do this, it will use the key. Now you're saying, oh, but you're not setting the key. I use something called SSH add, which sets your keys into the session. And we're in. There you go. So we're in as deploy. As you can see, there's the username there. Deploy. Great. But let's turn off that huge security hole we set by going back to the server, turning off password authentication, and also turning off root login. We should never need to log in as root. And let's restart SSHD, and that's it. So we can no longer log in as root to this box. Permission denied. Sorry, my chair keeps sliding down. There we go. Yeah, so we can no longer log in as root. We can only log in as deploy. So even if I, left this server up there, and you guys know my password, if I haven't blanked it out of this video, you can't get in because I've disabled password, and you can only get in using the key, and you don't have my key, of course. So there we are. Let's get on with the show and the good stuff. So let's prepare to install Ruby. We need Node, and we need the password because we're doing sudo or sudo. Curious as to which you use, sudo or sudo. And we also need yarn because, as you know, 6.1 uses Node and yarn. And so we're just adding yarn into the list of apt sources so that we can install packages. And we also need Redis because, we saw before that if we wanted to do the cable stuff, ActionCable, we needed to have Redis, so we got to have Redis on this machine. So let's just update the package list, and we're ready to go. We can install all of the goodies that we need to get on with installing Ruby. And yeah, that's pretty basic stuff, mostly development libraries and things like that, so that we can compile and compile Ruby with all of the features that we need to have. This will take a second or two. I shall drink some tea in the meantime. We're done. Let's get on with installing Ruby. So we've done the prep. We've created the server. We've done copied the keys. We've done the prep. Now let's get on and actually install Ruby. I'm going to be using RbEnv. I find this to be the best way on a server to manage your Ruby packaging. You don't have to mess around with the system Ruby and all that stuff like that. So let's get RbEnv and set the environment variables, blah, 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 so that we can use RbEnv properly. And let's get Ruby build in there. So that lets us choose different versions of Ruby. And this is just setting up everything so that RbEnv is in the path and is the Ruby that we're going to use. There we go, good to go. So let's install. I'm going to install Ruby 2.7.2 because that's the Ruby that I was using for the cable guy demo the other week. So go off. This might take a minute or two, so I might cut the video here. Whew, we're done. That didn't take too long. So we have Ruby 7.2 installed. Now let's tell RbEnv that this is the version of Ruby we want to use globally. And let's just see. Yes, indeed, of course, it's 2.72 is the Ruby version that's available. The other thing we want to do is install Bundler at this level, kind of at the root level, because we will need it to install Rails and everything like that, which is kind of above the application, if you get what I'm talking about. So there we go. Let's install Bundler, and again, let's just check it. Yeah, all good. For fun, I'm going to quickly do an update because we saw earlier that there was 85 packages available to upgrade. So this will just go through, pull down everything available for to be updated. It just takes a minute and makes sure your server is up to date with all security and everything like that, and gives me another chance to drink some tea. So while that's doing that, quick recap. So we have set up the machine, set up the deploy user, got the key for the deploy user on there, added the packages that we needed to install Ruby, and we've installed Ruby, and now we're updating the machine. And the next thing is to install Nginx and Passenger, which is my web server of choice. And I think a lot of people in the Ruby on Rails community are using Nginx and Passenger in production, because that's what we're doing here, is setting up a production system. All done, all cleaned up. Okay, so again, what we need to do is add the Nginx stuff into APT so that we can install a package. There we go. Yep. So first line did Nginx, and second line did Fusion. So let's install Nginx and the extras and Passenger. There we go. And if there hasn't been a conf file set to run this on restart, let's set one of those in there. And just make sure that it did go in, and it did. And let's edit the Passenger conf, because Passenger doesn't understand that we are running Ruby here using RbEnv. So we just need to tell it that we are. And there we go. That says in our home deploy directory, RbEnv will have created a .rbenv directory, and inside of there are the shims that use the correct version of Ruby. So if we want, we can start Nginx, and if we grep for Nginx, we should see something. There it is. It's actually running and working. Wonderful. We can remove this default website conf that Nginx gives us because we're not doing what they're talking about. We're going to create our own in a second. So we need to make our server secure, and we're going to do that using UFW, which is the Ubuntu Firewall. And first thing, I just let any outgoing traffic out. This is just a demo system, so sure, why not? If it wants to get out, let it get out. Then we pretty much block everything. We allow Nginx port 80 and 443 to go through, and we allow, of course, SSH to go through. So that's good. We're all set up. So now let's configure Nginx. First thing we need to do is to create the basic HTTP file, and you do that in sites enabled, and you just need a really basic file, because what we're going to do is redirect anything to being HTTPS. So that should do it. It listens on port 80 for IP6 and IP4, and it listens on the server name of www if you're being average, and we also need to insert just fear of being average, I realize, because people might come already without the www, and we're going to redirect it to HTTPS fearofbeingaverage.com with the request URI. Now, In 2021, well, in 2020 and 2019, we don't do HTTP websites anymore, you know, running on port 80 and all of that. We, and Google, more importantly, want everything to be HTTPS. It secures a lot of things for the customer, and even the basic end user now understands that websites need to be secure. So we want to have SSL certificate. Now, back in the old days, we used to have to pay for that quite heavily, but thanks to the folks at LetsEncrypt, we can use something called certbot to just generate an SSL certificate that will be valid for 90 days, and we just have to update that every 90 days. Totally free. And then we are going to run certbot. Now what I do is I do it in the cert-only mode, which means that it just generates certificates and puts them under the system, because I have a special way that I want to do my Nginx conf file. And we are good to go. It has generated the 2 PEM files that we need. It's put those in this standard path, and that is the full chain and the private key. As it says, these are good for 90 days. To non-interactively renew, you can just run certbot renew. It's amazing that we can do this. It's another thing that has been demonetized and decentralized. So we're good to go. We have our SSL certificates. That means now we can go on and create our Nginx SSL file. So I'm going to paste this in, and then we'll talk about it. So what we do here, of course, we're listening on 443 as SSL. We are listening just for a server name of fear of being average, because we are redirecting. And we don't want somebody coming in www. We have our SSL certificate and key in these 2 places that we just saw that being generated with certbot. This is going to be our deployment directory. We turn on passenger. We set the environment to be production. We set some locations for log files. We set up ActionCable. And that's pretty much it. Good to go. So we can sudo nginx -t, check that file. It says the file is okay. Of course, that's a little bit of a lie, because we don't actually have the directory. So why don't we just create that directory now? I think we just need to do that. So we got nothing here. Make dir cable guy, because we're going to need that in a second anyway. So let's get on to the database. We've set up Nginx and everything. Let's get on to the database. And now, if you remember, on the episode where I created the cable guy app, I used MySQL. On production, I feel like using Postgresql. So we need to do a couple of things. First of all, we need to install PostgreSQL on this machine, or PostgreSQL, or Postgres, or however you want to say it, on this machine. So let's do that. We should be doing it managed, but we're not. We're going to do everything local, like I said before. Let's install this thing. 122 megabytes of extra gubbins. All ready to go. And that's that. Now, let's actually log in. So we're inside. You can see that the prompt has changed. And let's create the user of deploy. And it's going to ask us for a password. And let's create a new password. Write that down. So we create a password for this database user. And let's create the database using that user. Done. And we can exit. Oops. That's it. We've created the database. That's all we need to do here. Now, the way RbEnv works is very nicely gives you a file that you can use to set your environment variables. So let's set our environment variables. And what we need is the database. The password is that. So this is our database URL. And we'll just create some kind of secret key number. And we put those in. That's all we need to do. And now, based on the changes that we're going to make to the database YAML file, we will be able to see our database. So we need to go back into CableGuy and change. So we are using MySQL. So we're not going to use that for everything. We're just going to move that down to inside of the development. This thing bugs me. Development and test space, so local. And then what we will do is add the lines for the Postgres gem file. And because we've changed the gem file, that means we need to run a bundle. Oops. Let's do it on the actual local machine. Excuse me. So that will install Postgres gem. All that other good stuff there you can see. So, wow, we've done a lot. Flown through here. Created the server, created the users, installed Ruby, installed Nginx, got that all going, installed Postgres and the database. Now we're getting ready to set the stuff inside of the Rails app to actually deploy this sucker. So, first thing we need to do is add the Capistrano stuff into our gem file. So let's go to the bottom. Deployment. I'm going to use Capistrano. And that's it. So we just go over. Let's bundle. Probably be fast because I've done this for another thing using the same Ruby. There they are. All good to go. And we can run cap install, so that will create the files that we need to use Capistrano in production only. And it has created the deploy RB and the production and the cap file. So we can edit the cap file. And what we need, we're using RbEnv, so let's open up that. What's the other ones we need? We need passenger. Oh, we're done with that. We need passenger. And there isn't just a raw Rails one, so we'll just do Rails. I think that's all the changes we need in the cap file. No. We can set the type to be user. And a version of Ruby. If you're using a different version of Ruby, you can just change this throughout wherever I've done it. This whole process will work for anything from 2 point whatever up to 3. So in deploy, let's go in and we need to set our app name, which is CableGuy. And we need to set our repo, which is this, my GitHub. And we need to set our branch, which I'm going to just use the main branch. And we need to set where we are going to actually deploy this thing. else do we need? Our directories that we do post deployment, and the releases. We don't really need to do that because the default is 5. Now in production, we just need to set our server and the user that we connect that server with, which is deploy, and the roles of that, which is everything app and web and DB. So that should actually be that. We should now be able to run cap production deploy and see this thing work. So let's give it a shot. You know it's not going to work first time. Nothing does. Goes out, connects to GitHub. Seems to be deploying everything. We'll run the bundle, install all the stuff we need for the bundle. Okay, now you might be seeing that it has failed. Don't ask me why it always does this. It seems like the first time passenger can't start, it tells passenger to restart. Well, of course, it's not going to restart because it hasn't started once. So I don't quite understand why it does that, but as they say in Japan, shogunai. And now it should be working. So let's give that a shot. Move over here. Okay, and as we know, that's our basic site because we don't have any data. So let's, as a little bonus here, I always create something which is called I call a console file, which lets us open the Rails console on the server. So let's just quickly create this console file. And as you can see, it just changes to the current directory, and executes bundle exec Rails. So now we can say bash console. So we can quickly jump into console, and I'm going to just cheat and grab this out of the seeds and run that. Here we go, created some books. Now if we go back and look, there's our books. So great, it looks like everything is running. If we book library book.all.sample, what is it? How about you spell library right? And then book.update status on loan. Does that, and even our action cable is working. So there you go. I hope this helped. Yes, it's based on the Go Rails tutorial. I think I've added some extra stuff in there, and hopefully you've learned something from it. If so, please hit the like, the subscribe, the bell notification, and we'll see you again soon. And I'll be doing some more Rails stuff for you, and of course talking about tech entrepreneurship coming up soon. Thanks for watching. See you soon.